Uh, Hello and good day to everyone. Maybe good morning, maybe good afternoon, maybe good evening or good night, wherever you are. Welcome to another virtual DDD with Mike this time around. And we're going to talk about domain experiments. Now, for the people in the Zoom chat, I'm going to repeat it. Please chat away. You are allowed to unmute yourself. This session will be recorded, so if you don't want to be on the recording, please keep your video off, so you won't be recorded. But you can always unmute yourself if you have questions along the way. So do that. If you don't want to unmute yourself and ask questions, but you do have a question, you can also chat away. And for the people on YouTube, please, if you have questions, also you can chat away to us. And without further ado, here is Mike. Thank you, Mike, for coming.
Thanks for inviting me. Okay, so I believe we are ready to start, right?
Yes, let's go.
Awesome. Okay, so hi everyone. Yeah, so the light is not very good on my side, unfortunately, so I hope you can at least see some part of me. Okay, so anyway, just as Kenny said, let's make it interactive. So whenever you got any questions, just interrupt me. You can unmute, you can ask your questions without raising your hand, just make it natural. And if you have some more complex questions regarding which might require a bit more discussion, then please also use chat. We will have probably about 20 or even more minutes of questions and answers session after the presentation. So that's also a perfect moment to have a bit more detailed discussion on domain experiments and my approach to creating software. Okay, so without any further delay, let's start. So I'll share the screen, just a moment. Okay, can you see the screen? Awesome.
Yes.
Okay. So as a warm-up, have you ever written a code without understanding why you are doing this? Why you've written this very particular piece of code? You can answer in chat or unmute. Just you can raise hand or just say yes, no.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Personally, it happened. Yeah, it happened multiple times in my career. And it's always a very bad sign, actually, right? So we as developers have a tendency to actually be pretty good at understanding what they are building, but not why they are building this, right? So the next question is, would you like to have a real impact on business decisions? And by real impact, I mean not just implementing things reactively, but actually being kind of technical partner for a business. So you can understand what's happening underneath. You can propose solutions, not only on a technical level, but also on a business level. So would you like to have such an impact on building the software?
I see some yes, and impact is nice. Well, I definitely do.
Yeah, I feel more natural when I actually know what I am building and why I am building this. So and feeling that I am a part of building a product, right? But there is actually a group of developers that just like working on tech stuff without actually being engaged in discussion with domain experts. Yeah, so personally, I would like to have such an impact. So domain experiments is exactly about that. Being able to have that kind of impact on building software, understanding why you're building this, not only what you're building, and having a tool to actually be able to communicate and ask good questions very early during development. So domain experiments is a tool that actually helps you to become a technical business partner, not just a developer. So let's move on. Or maybe you have some questions?
So far, no questions, I think.
Awesome. Let's move on. Okay, so let's start with a story of some project and some team. So imagine a great team of experienced developers that used to create very good code and were aware of good design principles, followed all the clean architecture principles used during development, domain-driven design, had very good understanding of distributed systems. So we might say they were masters of the technology. But at the same time, they were not technical business partners. Yeah, when they tried to implement DDD, when they tried to apply DDD to the software building process, they actually used something I sometimes call DDD light. Yeah, just the building blocks, finding the aggregates, domain services, factories, and that kind of stuff. Yeah, something very close to the code on the technical level, and not on the strategic level, not on understanding why we are even building this. So this team was really great, and it's based on my personal experiences. But since they were not focused on business stuff, on understanding why they're building this, what do you think? What was the result in such case? Was it a success? Well, actually, it was a total failure. Yeah. So they thought they are going to build something awesome, but they produced yet another toy project. Okay, why? Well, mostly because we as developers, generally we as people, don't know what we need upfront, right? So building software is actually all about discovery and learning, yeah? And this particular team failed because they were simply learning too slow, not learning just technical things, but learning about the domain, learning about the processes, learning about business models, learning about all the complexity of running this business, yeah, and understanding their needs. So the question is, what can we do about it? Yeah, I won't wait because the answer is quite natural. We need to simply learn faster, right? So what's the best way to learn, in your opinion? How do you learn the best, usually? Do you prefer theory? Yes, understand. Jennifer says understanding and talking about it a lot. Yeah, that might be also a good idea to learn. But when we actually start implementing stuff, talking and the understanding, sometimes it's not enough, right? Rebecca says doing with someone who knows more than I do. Yeah, and doing. Yeah. So Rebecca and Tony said doing. Yeah, that's important thing here actually, right? It's very hard to truly understand something without failing, without doing again, without building MVPs. Yeah, you get what I mean, right? We as developers especially like to do things, right? So just like children, yeah, by practice, by experimenting, yeah. After all the practical science is based on experiments. So the question is, can we run this kind of experiments in code directly? You know, there is such a thing called prototype. It's quite overloaded term, but generally speaking, prototypes might be the good approach to actually learn about your product, right? You just have a very simple MVP, and after this another version, and you iterate. You are checking if it's working correctly. You are checking the how your users react on this on changes. So it sounds like a good thing, but the problem with prototypes is that are quite expensive actually to build, right? So since experiments are the prototypes are quite expensive, yeah, because you need to build everything, all the layers, etc. Then the better approach might be to run experiments directly on the domain model, on the HUD, of the software, because that's the place, that's the area where we actually discover the most. So during this presentation, I'm going to show you how we can run greenfield experiments, and we will focus on this. Greenfield experiments is about creating something new, building some new feature, and checking whether it works okay or not. And I'll just show this part of greenfield experimentation. There's also legacy experimentation, but it's not in the scope of this presentation. So what you see here is actually a flow of running domain experiments. So what you start with is usually some kind of knowledge crunching. You can use any technique you are comfortable with. You can use event storming, you can use big picture event storming if you want to, you can use process level event storming. You can just have some meaningful chats. Yeah, basically all the things you usually do to know to crunch some knowledge. And now the important thing is that after having the knowledge crunching session, you should have a pretty decent understanding of the processes, or at least initial version of the business processes which are happening in your business, right? So since we learn the best by experimenting, by working on something concrete, usually a good idea is to move on to some kind of example mapping, right? You don't need to map all the examples, or you don't need to express them in a very detailed way. What you do, you see some processes, and now, okay, so let's take this example. Okay, and another example about this process, and so on and so on. And what happens next, after having these examples, the next part of domain experiments is actually something I call code storming. In contrast to actually event storming part. So we are not just placing stickies, but since we start working on very concrete examples, usually it also involves some design level thinking, tactical level thinking. We are usually left alone as developers during this part, yeah? So in such a case, if we had some examples, had some discussions, found out the processes, now it might be a good time to actually take these examples, write them as tests, create the initial model to support the first test, then verify and challenge the model, yeah, to see if it still works okay, if it can fulfill the requirements, and ask others to verify and challenge the model. So what I propose is this is the moment when you actually run the mob programming. I'm usually not a huge fan of mob programming as it utilizes too much resources. But during this stage, during the experimentation, it works very, very well. So you all as a team work on this. Have some new examples, verify, refine it, refine the model, and then again, take another example and create the initial model. As you can see, this is actually the same thing as test during development, but applied directly to the domain, model, to the heart of the software, right? So we are not starting with APIs, with a top-bottom approach, with defining contracts, because what we want to do, we want to understand what's happening underneath. We want to be able to ask good questions about the processes. And thanks to code storming, we might see some inconsistencies very early on, not 6 months later, but during first stages of implementing the project. So after having the code storming, if model is accepted, we can say, okay, that's a good model at this point, probably the best we could build. So let's create the ADR, architecture decision record, that will describe why we decided to actually choose this model, what were our requirements, and what are the consequences of building such a model. Yeah. Thanks to the architecture decision records regarding the domain model, we can see and understand the thinking process of our predecessors. Yeah. So whenever we join onto a new team and there is some strange idea of the model underneath, we might ask our colleagues that used to work on the project previously, and they say, okay, just check the ADR number 15, yeah, and you will understand why we decided on this model, because we crunched the knowledge and understood more than you are currently thinking about, right? But if model is not accepted, what you do, you still have a pretty good artifacts, and these artifacts are good questions you can ask to domain experts. So what do? You share your findings with business and ask more questions, right? And go back to the knowledge crunching session together with your domain experts. Okay, and everything repeats. So that's the overview of how I usually experiment on greenfield things, right? On greenfield projects or greenfield modules. Okay, but to make it work, actually, the feedback loop must be short. Yeah,
we have some questions.
Awesome.
We have who should accept the model?
Yeah. So mostly we as developers, but after asking right questions. Yeah. So if during your experimentation you had some findings, you had some great questions, right? And the thing is that what you do, you as developers actually go back and ask more questions and more questions and more questions, and based on that, actually, you decide whether you accept the model or not. Model is not something that's interesting to business experts, to domain experts, right? That's something we do. That's something that's used to actually implement this. And then I've been doing this for years also. Yeah, it also works great for me. But we will see in practice how it might look like. Okay, do we have some more questions?
No, I think the other question was already answered, which was the examples as test evolve well during iteration cycles, aren't they?
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on. So to make it work, the feedback loop must be extremely short. And by feedback loop, I mean not only feedback loop like in the test-driven development approach, but feedback loop with your domain experts. So the idea is that after ending this session, you need to be able to go again to the knowledge crash and ask questions and repeat and repeat and repeat. And during the greenfield experiments, it's the single most important thing to actually be able to have a short feedback loop with your domain experts and to actually be able to work with them on a daily basis, right? Not once every 2 weeks, not once even a week, but during the very early stages, you should have access to them, preferably on a daily basis, right? So you can ask more and more and learn as much as you can, while it's extremely cheap to experiment and build your software. Then to actually find some inconsistencies in processes or understanding of processes after 6 months of development, right? So feedback loop must be short. And so if your team is actually unwilling to learn or challenge the previous decisions, yeah, basically experimentation won't work. Yeah, you shouldn't even try it because you will only waste your time. Yeah, so that's a hard requirement. Be able to actually work with people that care and people that can challenge the previous decision. They can say, okay, yeah, according to ADR 15, we made such a decision, but eventually it turned out to not be the best one after having new findings. So what we do next, we create another iteration, we create another ADR after this iteration, and we simply supersede the previous model decision based on some new feedback. Okay, so I mentioned previously that example mapping is really great here, and again, it all boils down to what we said before, that there is no better way to actually learn by concrete examples. Yeah, Examples help us to clarify the requirements. And by examples, we can understand what we really need. Yeah, we as a product team, not we as developers.
So a
Yep.
question in between, how are code in these experiments different than production code?
Okay, so the first thing is that you don't need to actually include this in production code base. If you have some experiment and you just check it on you create a new model, usually expressed as POJOS or COJOS, or you know what I mean, without any infrastructure, application layer, UIs, just understanding the business model. Yeah, just working on this. The idea is that it doesn't have to be a walk-in product. It doesn't have to be included as a walk-in feature in the production code base. You can even say, okay, so we experimented for a few hours and we don't feel it, we don't understand it, we definitely can't include it. So what do? You ask more questions and you ask more questions. So you can even throw away some iterations of these experiments and still have a very meaningful questions to ask to your domain experts. Okay. So now when you combine the example mapping with test-driven development, it works really great. And I'd like to show you how it might look in action. So let's first start with the definition or very initial requirements of the domain we are working on. And this domain, this project is called crowdsourcery. So crowdsourcery is a fundraising platform which allows investors to invest into any kind of asset. Borrowers then repay loans. Crowdsourcery is a fundraising platform which allows investors to allocate their money passively, and this is important, passively, into groups of assets using automated strategies. Yeah, so you have some cash. You don't want the inflation to eat all of it, so you want to somehow allocate your funds, right? But at the same time, you don't have enough time to pick up options manually. So what do? You say, okay, I would like to invest into that kind of project that meets some criteria, right? So that's the point of crowdsourcery, of this example domain, which we will be working on during this presentation. So the very initial requirements we have so far are following. Any borrower can start a fundraising to finance her project. Then investors can invest into assets. Investors receive returns based on the asset they invested in, and borrowers receive funds to finance the project based on the schedule. So these are very initial requirements and are quite generic, I would say. There are no details how it should work. And that's how it usually looks during the greenfield projects or greenfield features as a separate modules, right? So during this presentation, we will start with the first requirement. Any borrower can start the fundraising to finance the project, and we will see how the process looks like, how experimentation looks like, and we will see how we can start asking very meaningful business questions just by iterating on code. But before we get to the code, we need to start with some kind of knowledge crunching, right? So we can use some big picture stuff or whatever we prefer. In this demo, we will start with the big picture event storming session. Naturally, it's not all about this project. Yeah, in reality, it would be much more of these events. And if any one of you is not familiar with event storming, I'll just say that all that's important here is that we gather as a team, including business, yeah, and we just say everything that's happening in our vision of the project, or in case of legacy project, what's currently happening. in our systems. So these stickies are usually expressed as events, so they're in past tense, and that's why we are able to actually produce meaningful questions, like meaningful stories, and then ask questions. Yeah. So it might look like project funded. Someone might say, okay, the project is funded. Yeah. Investment made. It's completely out of order. Yeah. And from many contexts. Interest paid, project canceled, funds received, deposit made, funds withdrawn. Yeah. And a lot of others. So what usually happens next, we need to make some order out of it. Yeah. We need to try to group these events into some meaningful processes. And in this demo, I'm not going to show you how you can use different tools such as pivotal events, swim lanes to actually understand the processes and group them and find the boundaries between them. So let's just imagine that we skipped few steps and we managed to find important business processes from this mess. And the first process might be, for instance, fundraising. Yeah, and you can see it's ordered. Yeah, so borrower registered, then schedule is accepted, then project is started, and project can be cancelled, or funds can be received. And after receiving funds enough time, the project can be fully funded, right? On the other hand, from the perspective of the investor, it might look like this: investor registered, deposit made, then investment made. Yeah, and we might have questions. Okay, so when investments actually happens based on paying deposit, yeah, here would be some kind probably of a policy of strategies also of these automated strategies, but it's not important at this stage. Yeah, we just group in stories. Then project might be funded after having investment made repeated enough times. And then there is a branch. Interest can be paid or payment is not received on time. If payment is not received on time, the project is defaulted. And in other case, if interest is paid, then project is fully repaid after some time and funds can be withdrawn. Yeah, there are holes in these processes naturally, but I am just showing you the very first iteration. Yeah, how it might look like. So we have some processes. Okay, so what we do next, we try to actually translate these processes based on some use cases into examples. Yeah, so one of the key activities that's actually happening here is starting a project, yeah, or fundraising a project. Yeah, so example mapping is extremely simple idea. You take some activity like start new project, and then you say, okay, so let's make examples. Examples are here expressed in green stickies. The blue ones are rules. So if you got some rules initially, if you know them, you might place them here. But from my experience, usually you start with examples and you find out the rules. Yeah, but if you have some intuition, you might say, okay, this is the rule, this is another rule, and here are the concrete examples. So these concrete examples might look like this: adult borrower starts a project. Yeah, so you see, there is no actually some BDD style. There is no given, when, then. It's just the case where something happens. Yeah, it usually read in past tense, like the one where something happened, or the one where something happens, the case where adult borrower starts a project, or the case where borrower without criminal record starts a project. Yeah, or the case where it's okay to fund the project when less than $10,000, or need to be the one where it need to be verified manually when greater or equal to $10,000, right? And so on and so on. As you can see, there are not many examples yet here, and it's okay. It's not about having thousands of these stickies. It's about having something that will lead us to produce concrete behavior, concrete examples to practice this on examples. Yeah. And so let's start maybe about with this one, adult borrower starter project. Yeah. As you can see, there are no specific cases here. And we just say, okay, adult borrower starts a project. It's kind of generic. And now what we do next, we will keep splitting this into even more concrete examples. But this time, we will not do this on whiteboard, but in code. Because that's usually the moment when you have some examples, you finished your part of the session with domain experts, with business. And usually we are left alone as developers and we got some more time. So what we do, instead of just working on whiteboard, we might say, okay, so since they're just developers, why not try to hack stuff and see what happens? We will probably discover more thanks, for example, to having nice typing system. Okay, so let's switch back to the project and let's just look at this adult borrower starter project from activity starting a project. So what I do next, what I do at the very first iteration, I'll create a new test class and let's name it starting a project. Okay, yeah. So just like this. It's usually a good idea to have some meaningful description of this. I am using Java and JUnit 4. I'm not a huge fan of Spock because of refactor issues, but Spock is also very, very nice. But let's say starting a project, yeah, based on examples taken from not the internet Copilot, but taken from our Miro board. I can even include a link here if I want to. Okay, so yeah, this is just about starting a project here. And now, after having starting a project, let's take concrete examples like adult borrower starts a project. Yeah. So what do we do next? We will express this new example. Yeah. So given adult borrower, when we can even say some more named George, yeah, so it can be a bit more personal. When George wants to start fundraising of his project, right? Then project fundraising should be started, something like that, right? Yeah, there are no rules, as you can see. Yeah, that's a very, very initial description of what we want to express, and the rules will follow in next examples. Yeah, you see, we got nothing here. It's just an empty project without any domain logic, without any code written in. So that's just completely empty project, right? And without having anything, let's try to translate this. So since we have an example, we have a test. So let's start iterating in a TDD fashion, something like borrower, right? Someone might try to type it as the adult borrower, but let's start with the simple approach. Yeah, we don't have a borrower. So what we do, we create one, right? Okay, and we go back, right? Okay, so borrower. Okay, yeah, okay. Now, this borrower should be named George, so we can say, okay, George, right? And we can change it. Okay, so it's the it can accept a name, right? What happens next is that there needs to be actually some kind of system which accepts this request to start fundraising, yeah? And according to Alberto Brandolini, it's really important how the system is named. We will find it out later. So what I will do, I'll just say some system, some fundraising system or something like that, right? It's not important at this stage. So, okay, we don't have such a thing. So let's create it, right? Okay, let's create it. So system, And this system should accept the command to actually be able to start the fundraising, right? So what we do is that the system start fundraising, yeah, for example, by borrower, right? Or we can even rename it to George. Okay. Oh, yeah, something. Yeah, something like that. Okay. So we get a system that allows start the fundraising by some borrowers, right? And now we need to express how our system behaves. So there are multiple ways how we could actually define it, right? But our initial approach might be, okay, so since we started with all the events, right? Since domain events are central to our model, why not express everything as actually producing some kind of events, right? So what we can say, we might say something like, we might have something like this. Okay, so let's create it. So there are some events produced by this command. As you can see, that's quite close to the approach of actually having event sourcing, but it's just my personal approach of building stuff. It's not important in terms of domain experiments, how you're actually going to express this. This is just natural to me. So after having this this change, what we should do now is to be able to my IDE unfortunately failed to do it for me. So system start fundraising by, and now we can express things like, I don't know, events has occurred, event of type, project fundraising started, for instance, right? So let's create it. Okay, project fundraising started. Let's create such a class. Okay, actually it could be a record, not just a class. Okay, and project fundraising is started, right? Okay, and let's change it, and then we can assert that project fundraising is actually started according to some assertions, right? Something like that. Okay, so you can see it's just plain test-driven development at this stage, but the idea is it's applied directly to the domain, and we have no rules at this moment. We just start with completely fresh project without a single line of code. And the whole point of actually expressing this very, very first example is to start building the foundations of the ubiquitous language expressed in our domain model. And now the interesting thing is that we don't really need to implement, I don't know, some aggregates or any kind of stuff. Yeah, this is just a system. This is something that accepts something, and that's all. The model underneath can be actually quite CRUD-ish, yeah, CRUD-like. So the idea is that we are having more and more examples, speaking of ubiquitous language, based on the examples, how this process might look like. So this is the very, very first approach. But when we dig deeper, we will have more and more branches. Like we said, okay, there is an adult borrower, but you can see there are holes, yeah? We said adult borrower, but there is nothing about the age, nothing about the birth date or anything like this. So we should be iterating with new and new edge cases. So since we have adult borrower, we should also see what happens when borrower is not adult, right? And I'm not going to do this during the live coding, because I believe you see how we might start, how we might bootstrap the process, but instead I'll guide you through the pre-committed changes. So let me just reset everything. Okay, that's not this repository. Domain experiments here. Okay. Okay. Yeah, should be fine. Okay. So let's check the pre-committed step, the first pre-committed step. Yeah. And actually it's very close to what you've just seen, right? given adult borrower, when borrower wants to start a project, then project is started successfully. Yeah. So currently our system just says, yeah, always allowed to start any project, any fundraising, always. Yeah, there are no rules yet. So by looking at this, yeah, we need to start asking more and more questions. So what happens when borrower is not adult, right? So let's move to this next example, right? And this next example might look like this. So I'm having a nested tests here. So reporting looks nice, but it's not a requirement. It's just a technical stuff. But you can see that in the starting the project case, yeah, it might look like this. Yeah, starting a project, given a little borrower, given a borrower who is 17 years old. Yeah, so the reporting is nice, but it's not important at this moment. Important is that we see, okay, given adult borrower, when borrower wants to start a project, that's the previous one, and we have a new one, right? Given borrower who is 7 years old, when borrower wants to start a project, then project is not started, yeah? And this is the single moment when you actually will produce the first if in your code, right? So we say that there is a borrower of age 17, and when borrower wants to start a project, that's the moment when you actually have this very first if. The previous version of start project by method in start project command handler looked like just always return project started. Oh, always project fundraising started. Yeah. Since we expressed another rule, another example, yeah, we keep changing the code. Yeah. So again, it's a test-driven development, but applied to only to the domain model. Okay. And we keep iterating in such a manner. So let's take a look here on the next step. And during the next iteration, we might say, okay, yeah, not all naturally, we probably too young case should be parameterized. So like for 16, 16, 8, 4, 2, and 1 years old, right? And in each of these cases, the test, this example should not allow to actually start the fundraising, and it's expressed like this: after that, no events occurred at all, right? That was a technical change, in fact. Okay, and now the thing is that what we changed is, in the previous version, when we said borrower of age, we made a very, very stupid mistake of actually producing something called age instead of birthday. Yeah. So we changed that. Yeah. We changed that when we create an adult borrower, we say, okay, that there is a birth date instead of just giving age as it used to be in the previous case. Yeah. I know it's obvious, but the idea is that you can start doing very stupid things and then keep moving and improving your model to understand your business better, right? Okay, so now the important thing here is actually the step number 4, which I marked as the first breakthrough. Yeah, and the breakthrough is following. Okay, so we just keep looking at this code, and yeah, we can see, okay, so there's some system which allows to start the fundraising by some borrowers, and these borrowers needs to actually be in our system somehow, needs to get to our system somehow. But why do we even check the rules in a start fundraising system? Yeah, we are operating on money. We are serious. Should we even allow our users to not be adults? Yeah. So by looking at code, we might start asking more and more questions like this. Yeah. Probably we shouldn't even allow anyone to get into our system, yeah, to register into our system when they don't meet specific criteria. So what we can propose, we as developers, we can say, okay, so let's try to express some more examples, and then we will ask questions to our domain experts later on during the next session. And our assumption is that during the registration of the borrowers, we want to check if they're adults or not. Yeah. So that's why we produced a new case, the new borrower registers. And we say, okay, only adult borrowers can register their account. That's our assumption. That's something we should probably ask about during the next session. Yeah. And then we say, okay, so we don't even allow borrowers younger than 18 years old to register. They cannot register their accounts at all. They can't even get to the system. So in such a case, this very simple example shows us that we don't actually need to check this rule here. We can have maybe a different system, which during the registration checks whether borrower will register or not. We should have a hotspot here and ask a question during the next session. Okay, so after this, let's take a look at this example. Borrower without criminal record starts a project. Yeah. And let's get here. Okay, just a moment here. Yeah. The person with criminal record cannot register her account. Yeah. So again, you see, based on the previous experimentation, we might have yet another assumption. Okay, since we don't want to have our users to be able to register when they are not adults, should we allow criminals in our system? Yeah, the same thinking. Probably not. So that's our assumption. We don't even want to be able to register the borrowers. And in our model, we might express that there is something called the borrower registry. That's just a name. It can be anything, actually. Yeah, we might discover later on if that's the right name or not. We just say that we can register based on some registration form. Yeah, and during the registration, based on this registration form, yeah, we might say that we want to allow someone or we don't want to allow someone based on some specific rules, right? So, for example, we might have such implementation of borrower registry that checks the criminal record of new borrower. And let's imagine that there is such a thing called criminal record, which simply allows to check whether someone has criminal record. And let's imagine it's a strategy that probably connects to some third-party system, gathers the data, and returns our the final result. Yeah, it's simplified. Probably it should be asynchronous. Might take a bit longer, but you get the point. Yeah, that's the extension point. It's expressed in domain language, but at the same time, it might be implemented in a very technical way. So we say that we want to register based on the registration form, and we are simply checking this criminal record here, right? So then we can keep asking more and more questions. Maybe, I don't know. Okay, so what happens when someone had some very old criminal record, I don't know, 10 years ago, right? Should we accept it or not? Should it be, maybe there should be levels of criminal records, yeah? That we can say, okay, so when it's very light, if it's not anything serious, okay, then we might allow, right? And there are a lot of questions we might keep asking about this just by iterating on the domain model. There is not a single line of API, infrastructure, database, anything like this. We are just modeling processes. We are just expressing the behaviors of the processes, yeah, and it's very cheap. So, usually what I do is I try to include all the findings or all the assumptions back to the board, especially during the early stages, so we can have some meaningful discussion later on with our domain experts. So again, just by applying the same way of thinking, we might say, okay, it shouldn't actually be found here. What we should probably do, we should check during the registration, and maybe there is something new called borrower registry. We might then ask another questions. Okay, how do you exactly check that? Yeah. Is there some, I don't know, office? Is there someone who checks that, right? We just called it borrower register at stage, but it can be actually anything, right? But we might have some new propositions of new definitions in the system. Okay, and now the important thing is that we can keep moving to more rules. And these more examples are like, okay, when less than $10,000, or need to be verified manually when greater or equal to $10,000, right? So what we do next, we take yet another example and we keep iterating. So this another example might look something like this. Okay, so during starting a project activity, we have two concrete examples. Given project proposal of 9,000 total value, you can see there is some name we gave it. We decided to name it in some way. It should be always discussed with domain experts. We shouldn't make too much assumptions. It just felt natural to the developers, so they express it like this. But given project proposal of 9,000 total value, when borrower wants to start a project based on this proposal, then project is started successfully immediately. Yeah. So that might be the here underneath the any borrower actually is expressed that it's 9,000. It's probably a typo here. It should be included. So the test is very specific. But let's make it here. Let's take a look here. The another example would be contrary, that it needs to be verified manually when it's equal or greater than $10,000. Yeah. So given project proposal of 10,000 total value, when borrower wants to start a project based on this proposal, then project needs to be verified first. Yeah. And then again, just by looking at code, we might be asking, okay, so what about the verification? How it happens? So it needs to be verified manually, ultimately. How does it actually happen? Okay, yeah. So we say there we have some borrower, we have some project proposal of this borrower, yeah, with amount 10,000. Project proposal is just a document describing what we want to fundraise. And then we execute a command, borrower wants to start a project. And then we express it again by events. So events has occurred any event of type. What type? Type of project request accepted for verification. Yeah. And these are just very simple cases for our demo, but I believe you can see the potential to actually start asking more and more questions, right? So is it hard rule, or maybe there are some VIPs borrowers? So if we have someone that has been using our platform for 10 years, should we have such restrictions? Maybe not. Maybe we want to allow them to always start the fundraising without actually checking because they are verified already. Yeah. So you can see we can ask more and more and more questions based only on the processes and expressed only in very cheap to refactor and cheap to change domain model code. Yeah. The important thing is this domain model doesn't need to be complex. We don't need to apply all the aggregates and other tactical building blocks. We are just expressing processes, expressing examples, talking in ubiquitous language without actually defining how it's being implemented underneath. It's not important, right? So again, all the findings we might have is that there is when less than 12,000, we can say, okay, the project is started immediately, or when equal or greater, then project proposal accepted is for verification, and then we might have a hotspot how verification works, right? You can also see that during these stages, we actually created some new definitions again, like project proposal, right? And maybe project proposal supervisor, something like that. And this project proposal supervisor might be actually something that checks the rules of accepting or not given project proposals. Yeah. So I believe you actually where it's heading and how it might be being performed in greenfield experiments. We will take more another example, repeat the process, yeah, work together during this code storming session based on test-driven development loops. We will refine the model, we will try to challenge the model, we will gather questions, we will save these questions in hotspots. I even sometimes save questions in code simply by using to-dos comments or having some annotation like, okay, that's the hotspot. Sometimes I even express hotspot as an interface because I'm not sure how it should behave, right? So the important thing is to actually have these questions, yeah, and keep asking and asking and asking and asking and asking. It might be exhaustive. And it might be kind of unusual to our clients when they first see it, because we are still talking with them, still asking more questions, still being quite picky, right, with all the details. But we need to explain to our clients that it's something that always needs to happen. But would you like to actually find out some inconsistencies later on after 6 months of development? When you decided on specific solutions, when you decided we want to use Kafka, we want to use Kubernetes, or we want to go with Lambdas, when we have everything set up? Or would you like to discover what we really need, what we want to build, why we are building this, what are the most important processes and how this process should be expressed very early on, right? It's cheap. Changing just this simple code without any infrastructure at all, without having prototypes, is extremely cheap. And for me, domain experiments is just a way to actually gather the domain knowledge, to find out all the inconsistencies when it's still very cheap to make all the changes. Okay, so basically that would be all about the demo of a greenfield experimentation. We will have questions and answer sessions now. If you want to ask any questions, I would love to stay in touch, so you can mail me or connect on LinkedIn. And if you enjoyed what you've just seen, you can check out my website, How to Be Pro, where I cover a lot of things related to building good domain models, understanding true requirements, and generally everything that's universal, no matter what language or framework we are using. So thank you very much. And I believe and hope we will have some questions. Is it so?
Kenny? Yeah, thanks, Mike, for the presentation. So we got a couple of questions in the chat. The first one was from a while ago, and I wanted to ask that after the presentation is, for greenfield, the amount of time might take in its current form might be acceptable, but what with brownfield it can be a lot more difficult because see, massive inertia and business stakeholders might get frustrated. It can be a lot harder to see the existing models differently. And somehow to overcome that inertia.
Yeah, that's the question of Eman. I can see it. Yeah. So basically, during the brownfield project, You can still apply all the known patterns, such as strangle pattern, apply to the domain, which is sometimes called bubbling context. And the idea is that you take what you have and you start expressing this in new terms, in new language. And during the brownfield experimentation, it might be quite destructive, as you said. The inertia is quite huge. So what I usually start with, before defining the terms and creating the bubbling context, I just do some very simple draft code in a separate package or in a separate branch, and I'll just try to hack stuff to keep asking more questions. So imagine you have some legacy process which is quite complex and hard to understand. What you do next is you take just this process and you try to map this into some examples. These examples probably are hard to understand, but what you do next is you try to create some new package. You can copy classes if you want to. It's okay to copy paste here, and you keep working on it. And you see, okay, so it's currently done like this. Maybe we should change this. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We got more questions. Maybe we should ask how it behaves and how it really behaves, right? Or how it should behave. And what you do next, if you iterate it multiple times, you are still not interfering with the production. Yeah. You just copy pasted some stuff. You are working on a separate branch or on a separate package. Probably separate branch is the best way to have these experiments. It will take you about maybe a few hours, but you will have a massive amount of questions, and then you keep asking more questions. Okay, so it's how it's done currently. Should it be done this way? Maybe we should go the other way. Maybe we should change how our processes are implemented and our processes behave. And then after having some more questions and more answers to these questions, what you can start doing is to start applying the mentioned public context. So you take what you have, you are feeling quite okay how it should behave, and you start introducing new terms expressed in new language, the language you would like to have in your system, but the implementation is still using all the legacy stuff in your project. Yeah, so basically a strangle pattern combined with ACL to the domain. Sometimes people call it bubbling context. Yeah, that might be the idea how you might actually overcome this, and that's something I tried and managed to have quite good results, but it depends, right? Still, you need to be able to have short feedback loop. So when I'm working with clients that well, don't want to meet, don't want to participate in these sessions because they think, oh yeah, we have the documentation, we paid for it, we paid €1 million for it, and now we just need to implement this, right? So in such case, it might be disastrous. But even if you have very bad code, very bad architecture and design, you can still achieve a lot by following these principles. If your team, not just development team, your product team cares and want to have these sessions. Okay.
Cool. Then the next question, let me see, where was it? You have some threads. So there was one, and other people answered as well. What are the benefits of discovering business rule writing tests and code instead of compared to examples on cards, or as reading them up?
Yeah. The thing is actually that I always give quite a good example of board games. I mean, you can imagine a board game with a book of rules, right? And even if it's this book of rules is written very, very well, it can be interpreted differently. Even in the best rules, which represent those stickies, if they are not being executed, we will not see some inconsistencies. Plus, when we express our behavior in code, if we keep creating good type system, we will see some inconsistencies. We will see that if we typed something as I don't know, a project proposal draft, which can be then translated, which can be moved onto a project proposal, and then maybe accepted project proposal, you will have a quite good graph of types which expresses what you really need. And you will see this in code. You will see that if some processes say, okay, so we take this project and we start with being already accepted, you will see immediately, okay, it can be story accepted. If you want to start with, you need to start with draft. Yeah, and you will see this in code. It happened multiple times to me when we've been working only on a whiteboard, even with very, very good modelers. And we thought, yeah, that's obvious. Yeah, it would be okay. Yeah, that's natural. And then when we got to the code, only after that, we would see a lot of holes in our model, a lot of holes in our thinking, because code is strict and will not allow you to express something that doesn't make sense if you try to express this code well, right? So you're executing, you are checking, you are verifying, you are consuming all these examples immediately. And if there is some glitch between, you will know immediately, which you won't be aware of if you just produce some text, I don't know, text documents or stickies.
Great, thanks. So there's a some people ask to share the GitHub repo with people.
Yep, sure.
You can do that after as well, but just to remind that. And Aman wants to ask you a question.
Yeah, I thought I'll just say out my question here instead of typing. It's just slow.
Sure, awesome.
So I like the whole approach of doing this example mapping and creating these little sketches with code, essentially. Give you this fast feedback and you can iterate over it. But in your experience, how long has been the lead time to production, let's say,
so
with all this work?
Yeah, so we managed to actually have some working part of the system in about a month after running this experiment. So the idea is that you don't need to have all the technical details yet. What I usually do, I combine this experimentation or on the domain model with having some very, very simple, maybe not mocks, but some embedded databases, some very simple front ends for it, so we can deploy very, very fast and allow our clients to actually check just by clicking on stuff as well. So the whole idea is that experimentation on the domain model is cheap and will uncover a lot of things, but I still make some effort, but it's also very cheap to be able at least to allow our users to click on it, because even if we have a very good understanding, sometimes it's nice to have this visual included in the system. So if you say something working, then I would say after a week we can have such a working thing. But if you think of having something on production, I mean, with some chosen technologies, I would say that's about the minimum time is about a month, because you need to first understand what you need to build and to choose the right architecture at this point, right?
So
yeah,
so sorry.
No, so it really depends on the technology. But if you use like I've used this before, and we were in a acceptance environment, it could have well be a production within a week, because we use C# in that case, an Azure web app, set it up in a pipeline, and we could have something running in a
that's
but it wasn't production to the user, but it was production to our internal domain experts.
Yeah, and that's how I do it actually. Yeah, but important thing is that someone with very good domain knowledge should be able to actually, I don't know, click through this. It's not even a prototype. Click through this demo of implementation of processes. Yeah, that's probably.
I think generally what I found, at least in my experience, is that things become a little bit more tricky when you have a pre-existing system which you're, let's say, extending. And I just recently, a few months ago, I was working on one of the similar kind of works where we were supposed to extend the existing rule engine with new rules. Now, it took us good sort of back and forth with the business stakeholders to map out the rules using flowcharts and some example mapping, not using stickies, but spreadsheets. But yeah, the feedback with the code that we get, that was great, but also because the system was kind of already there, it was already running. The sort of push was to, okay, let's get this out somehow quickly so we can get some more feedback. I think that's the main challenge that I feel with trying to strike a balance between how quickly we can put something into production, depending on how much is already there, versus, hey, this is a brand new thing, we don't know what it is, so let's just put something out there.
And from my experience, rules engine don't help as well here.
No, certainly. It wasn't like a full-on engine, but yeah, it had rules and it had some simple if-elses, so yeah.
If you had problems with changing these rules, probably it should be classified as a brownfield experiment, and you should follow what I've said. Copy paste, try hack it. Basically apply the same rule as Spike, right? The same approach as Spike in extreme programming, but applied directly to the domain, right? Without any infrastructural stuff.
So final follow-up, and then I'll pass it on to the other guys. So you said for this kind of greenfield stuff, you are really kind of hacking on the domain model part and pushing something out. But at some point, you've got to then sort of pick and choose and design your architecture. Is that sort of a step that happens a bit later, or you're constantly doing it as you're evolving?
Usually a bit later. However, I usually try to be technologically agnostic. So even in the very early stages of development, I do some kind of ports and adapters style, something like that, but it doesn't need to be strict. The idea is to be able to change the infrastructural stuff based on some assumptions. It might be harder whether in case of distributed systems though, but what I do is I still allow to evolve in a good pace by starting always with modular monolith. So by combining some approach similar to porcelain adapters or clean architecture, if you prefer this term, and starting with modular monolith, you are quite elastic in terms of what modules, what contexts are actually need to be distributed, which should be separated, and you can express it in a monolith by making sure that these modules are actually communicating only via their APIs, right, and not with internals. And in such case, then you might make more decisions regarding your architecture, right? Architecture is a very broad term. It's not just about having MVC or having ports and adapters, not that kind of thing. Yeah, architecture is very broad, and in my perspective, it means everything that's important for the system. So if making decisions whether we want to, I don't know, use Kubernetes or we want to distribute some parts, we should always start building our system to be able to apply this evolutionary architecture, right? And so I don't make strict assumptions. I don't say, oh yeah, this will be always, I don't know, microservices, or this should be event driven. Yeah, I'm not telling such a thing yet. I start to model everything so I can change that easily when there is such a need. And if I decide to go some way, then I need to have good argumentation behind it, right? So it must be always business driven, from my experience. I know there are a lot of architectural drivers, including also performance, including consistency, including availability, including security, and that kind of things. But all of these drivers should always be actually part of some business driver. If I don't see business driver, then it doesn't make sense for me to choose any kind of architecture or any kind of design. I need to first see the business driver, why we are building this, right? And thanks to following domain experiments, you can get easier to this part, to understanding why you're building, and then you might have some decisions based on real requirements and not just stuff written in the documentation.
Thank you.
So to add a bit there, the act of doing a domain experiment is already an architectural decision. Well, so it's a design decision because you're designing, but you're actually allocating time to it, and it's shaping the system in the end. Which I don't go against doing this, but in itself, it can already be a significant design decision in a way that you're spending time, you're spending money that's irrevertible. So then it's already significant shaping your system, but you can throw it away. So it is significant. So it might already be an architectural decision. It's a good one, right? Because you're focusing on will this actually work?
Yeah, you might say, especially according to my definition, that architecture is everything that's important, yeah, and it's definitely important, right? Decision. So yeah.
So it's Grady Bush describes it as significant, and that's measured by cost. So in this case, if it takes you a week, shapes the system, and a week will cost you time and money, which is a architectural decision.
And I guess if we talk about, at least in modern architectures, the thing that is no longer difficult to change, perhaps, is the infrastructure. What is really difficult to, or could be quite difficult to change, is maybe the domain model or the wrong kind. And then, I would then consider that to be the significant part of your design, and you do want to spend some time on that. So it does make sense to be slow and deliberate on that, as opposed to kick it out and then see what happens. But I guess it depends on the context as well.
Yeah, if you have a very, very simple system which is totally obvious, then right, it can be something that ChatGPT can create for you, right? and then, or Copilot, and then you don't need to actually run any experiments, right? But in case of having actually any a bit more elaborate processes, especially spanning multiple context systems and the kind of stuff, it's always a good idea to actually understand the relationships between them. And the nice thing is that you can still express this. You can still express this in code if you just try. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks. So there was one more question on top, which is you're using DDD. I use the examples acceptance test on the model aggregates, and you use that as commands. So you test on commands in your example. Why not just focus on the model? Commands is a part of the process model event storm and would fit nicely before example mapping in this example, ? Any opinion on that?
You tell some comments here, why not just focus on the model? Okay, basically, I'm not sure if I understand it fully. Later on, when I use D, I use examples, acceptance tests on the model aggregates, and unit test the commands. Okay, so the idea is that I am not trying to find the aggregates yet at this point. I don't even know if I will need such building blocks. So I am expressing this on rather at a system level. I don't know what it is. It's just something Yeah, if you would like to, you can implement it almost in a functional style. I know in Java it's not so good, but you get the point. The idea is that there's something and you express the relationships between parts of the system. And you don't know whether it's an aggregate underneath or some domain service or some factory. Yeah, it's not important. You are not looking for aggregates at this point, mainly because you still don't know what are the consistency rules. You will find out what are the consistency rules. Aggregates all about being the guardians of consistency, not just groups of objects, right? So it's easier for me to start with the behaviors, to start with the examples, and then find the right model underneath. Okay, I don't know if I have answered your question, Danny. Okay, so do we have any more questions, Kenny?
No, no questions further. So thank you.
Kenny, I think there was one from Dimitri. Could you use parts of the code written in experiments in production? And if not, then why not?
Yes, you can use, especially when they are implementing some critical part of the process. So why not? Maybe not exactly in this form as you started doing this. Maybe you will need to refine it because it might get a bit dirty, right? But after polishing, yeah, definitely. Okay, so I believe that would be all. So thank you all very much for joining me. Thank you, Kenny, for inviting me to speak here. It was a pleasure. And let's stay in touch. Just find me on LinkedIn. Send me an email if you want to, or check out my website. So let's just stay in touch. Thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thank you, Mike, for your presentation and sharing your knowledge. This was it for tonight. Thank you all for tuning in. And we're going to have 2 more meetups, one more in a few weeks, one more in August. And then in September, we'll have another open space again. So look out for that and hope to see you at one of these. Thanks for interacting.